What's up everybody, my name is Ronald, and in this video I'm going to walk you through my Next.js implementation of how to design better APIs. So I published this blog post about a month ago on my HashNode blog. It tries to cover really the basics and the foundation of building better REST APIs and simple tips you can follow, such as being consistent or using UTC dates, providing a health check endpoint, or things you should avoid, such as not versioning your API, for example. And based on this blog post, I tried to create a project and compress and cover all these 15 tips into one single project. So I created this Next.js project. It's on my GitHub. It's called Better APIs. I'm going to link it in the description below. And let's jump right into the code. So before we get started, maybe let's have a look at the final result on what this API looks like. It's overly simplistic, of course. There is no database in the background. It's just like the API part covered. So let's see which routes are implemented. So we have a status endpoint, like the health check endpoint mentioned in the post. We have an endpoint to create users, to retrieve users, to retrieve a specific user, one update request, and also a delete request. So these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 routes or endpoints, if you prefer, which we're going to build, or which are built in the project. And before we get started and have a look at the code, maybe let's see how this API behaves and returns. So we have the status endpoint. By the way, the Postman collection is checked into the project as well. So if you want to have a look and play with the API, it's in the top level of the project here. It's the Postman collection. So the status endpoint, as you can see here, we have two variables. The first one is base URL, second one is version. And as you can already see, probably this one is currently set to v1. So right now we have version 1, the health check endpoint, which returns version 1 in this case, and if we change it to v2, we're getting another response. So this is actually really another version of the API, and I thought it would be a very neat way to use this variable so that we can quickly change the version of the API. So this one is the status endpoint. We have one endpoint to create users, which accepts a name and an email of a user. So if we call this one, we actually get a 401 unauthorized, which is expected because the status endpoint is public, which makes sense in case you have a load balancer, for example, that needs to call this endpoint. So as this doesn't return any confidential data, it usually makes sense to make it public. So this one is of course not public because not everybody should be allowed to create users. So what we can do here is, as I mentioned in the blog post, we can pass an API key header in this case. You can add any value here, it doesn't matter. It just checks whether or not the API key header is present. And if we save this and call this request again, or call this route again, we actually get an actual response. So we get a 201 created here, which is a more specific status code if a resource was created, because status returns 200, which is like as Postman says, like a standard response for successful HTTP requests. And creation usually returns 201, but you can do both, of course. So we have the post users request. We get the response, everything's fine. And then we have a retrieve users endpoint, so which accepts a page number and the page size. So as mentioned in the blog post, it's one of the last points. It's called use pagination. It's only one approach, of course. There are many approaches to achieve pagination. This one is one of them. So I only pass page number 1 and page size 10. And what we get in return is a paginated response object. So with the page number and the page size and total count of data, and also the chunk that we are retrieving right now. So we have page number 1, page size 10. We get 10 results, and we see that there are more pages and also a bit of information if there is a previous or a next page. So that's what I meant in the blog post. Pagination makes sense if you deal with lots of data. And again, there are many approaches. This is one of them, and this one is the one I implemented. Okay, so endpoint to retrieve all users. Then we have an endpoint to retrieve a single user. We pass an ID, so it's /users/ID. And this payload is actually wrong. I think this is just in the Postman collection, so we can remove this. So we pass the ID and we get one user in return. This is just random data, as I said, no real database in the background, but this is how it works. So get request with an ID, then we have a patch to update users, and we can again pass any ID, and we can only, for a user, we can only change name and email again. So yeah, this is to update the user, and if we call this, again, we get, as mentioned in the blog post, we get the change data, so the response and the current state of this object in the database. And the last one is to delete users, which is pretty straightforward. Again, HTTP delete request with an ID, and if we call this, we get 200 and nothing more. So that's it. So these are the 5. These are the 6 resources we implemented. And let's have a look at the code. So this is just a basic Next.js project, bootstrapped with create next step, so nothing fancy going on here. We have pages, and then we have API, and then we have, I think this one is pretty cool and pretty neat. So we have V1, we have V2. So these are top level folders within the API folder. So it's a very neat way to like version all endpoints that live inside this folder. So we have V1 status, we have V1 users. And for V2, we only have the health check endpoint. So I didn't add the users endpoints here. So I think you get an idea of how versioning would work in Next.js. So this is only the status request for now. So if we go back to the Postman collection and change V1 to V2 and perform this users request, we actually get for a page not found default response from Next, which makes sense because there doesn't exist a endpoint V2 users to create users. So this is the versioning bit. Again, then we have the status call, which is very, very simplistic. It's just a get request that returns 200 with the payload of the version, or with a bit more information on this version, let's say. And yeah, this is probably another one. So if we don't perform a get request to this route, or better say, or if we perform any other method, so if we perform a post, it doesn't work either. So if we change this to post, call this again, we get again the standardized error response with code and message and nothing else, and the 405 method not allowed. So yeah, that's the status endpoint. Again, very simplistic. And then we have the more interesting users endpoint. So we have this one to create users. It checks whether or not we are dealing with a post request, and then we have user create params, which we are expecting in this call. Let's change this to V1 again so that it works. V1, then post. So this should work again. And as I said, name, email is passed in user create params. We can also add a language, which is currently not used, but which could be used in the future. So as mentioned in the blog post, as specific as possible. It probably doesn't make sense to create a user with, lots of more data. Usually you have like, specific subset of data you want to pass during a create. And in this case, we only pass name, email, and language. So that's it. And if anything's missing, for example, the name or the email, language is optional in this case. So if anything's missing, we get a 400 with a bit more data on what went wrong. I can try this one again. Without the email, for example, then we get a 400 bad request with detailed information on what went wrong. So the code can usually be used on the client to, fetch translation files, something like that. And here's a bit more information on what went wrong. So this is actually this bit here, and I'm referring to this point in the blog post. So I'm using standardized error response. So no matter what goes wrong in the API, you always have a standardized response. You know what's happening, and you can look at the code and the message and act accordingly. So that's what I try to do with all endpoints that return errors. And if everything is fine, we can create the user with the body and return the created user. Again, as I said, normally we would use a database. In this case, it's just dummy data. So that's it. And then we return the 201 with the JSON payload. And the next one is the get request to fetch users, where we also accept the page number and the page size. And didn't mention this one before. It's to expand related data of a user. This is what I was referring to. I think it was the last point in the blog post. Allow expanding resources. Here was the example with users and expanding orders in one request. So I did something similar here. So we can also expand in our users request. We can also add expand orders, for example. And as you can see, if we pass this query parameter, orders are loaded as well. So that's a very nice way to avoid round trips and load related data in one go. So this makes sense. Just added this query parameter in a project of mine. I also can load child entities of, for example, orders. For example, orders.items. In this case, I can't do it, but I think you get the idea on how this would work. So this one is users, and then we have another file, the ID file, to retrieve a specific user or update users or a specific user, and also delete the user. So this is these are the endpoints for getting the user, updating and deleting. Again, very, very simplistic. And if we have a get request, we load the user from our database, which is in our case dummy data. And so if the user is not found, we get a 404 for resource not found. And if everything's fine, we get a 200. So as you can see, I used not many HTTP status codes. I use 200, 201, I use 400 and 401, 404. So actually not many status codes. And if I use some, I always use the same. So 201 for creation, 200 for general success, as mentioned in the blog post. So 404 for not found, as simple and as specific as possible. And then we have the patch request, where we update the user and then again return the updated record from the database, and also the delete request. So this one, the last here, if we perform the delete, we're going to delete the user and return 200 as well. And again, if I change to, I don't know, maybe to a head request, it doesn't work. It returns a 405 method not allowed. So that's basically it. I hope you get an idea, or you got an idea of how to implement clean and concise and consistent APIs in Next.js. And I hope it was helpful. If not, just let me know, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.